In late summer 1944, as Allied forces surged across Western Europe, the machinery that translated battlefield reality into clear strategic understanding began to strain. Reports flowed in from multiple fronts, often arriving late, incomplete, or already outdated by the time they were read. Advances that were supposed to take weeks unfolded in days. German resistance appeared to evaporate in some areas, while in others it hardened without warning. When British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and U.S. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall reviewed the latest situation briefings, both men sensed a growing disconnect between the information on paper and the reality unfolding on the ground. The numbers did not align, the timelines conflicted. Assumptions made only days earlier no longer seemed reliable. What troubled them most was not a single alarming report, but the pattern emerging across all of them. The campaign was moving faster than the system designed to explain it, and somewhere between the front lines and the highest levels of command, clarity was being lost. Churchill approached the problem with instinctive suspicion. Years of wartime leadership had taught him that danger often arrived disguised as success. Victories that came too easily demanded closer scrutiny, not celebration. He questioned whether intelligence assessments were keeping pace with events, or merely repeating expectations formed before the breakout from Normandy. Marshall, whose responsibility extended across the entire American war effort, shared the concern. He had spent years building systems meant to ensure order, coordination, and predictability in a conflict defined by chaos. Now those systems were being tested by speed itself. Briefings contradicted one another, frontline gains outpaced logistics forecasts, enemy strength estimates fluctuated wildly depending on the source. Together, Churchill and Marshall reached a quiet but unsettling conclusion. Something was not right, and the problem might not be the enemy, but the information guiding Allied decisions. As they re-examined the situation, the scale of the challenge became clearer. Allied armies were advancing into territory that German forces had abandoned with surprising haste. Entire defensive positions expected to delay the Allies simply did not exist. Roads were open, bridges intact, and resistance sporadic. On the surface, this suggested collapse. Yet deeper analysis raised uncomfortable questions. A retreat of this magnitude rarely occurred without intent. German forces, though battered, were not incapable of coordinated action. The absence of resistance could signal exhaustion, but it could also mask a deliberate withdrawal toward more defensible ground. Churchill worried that optimism at headquarters might be obscuring the risks ahead. Marshall focused on the practical consequences. Rapid advances strained supply lines, disrupted coordination between formations, and magnified the cost of any misjudgment. If the picture guiding command decisions was flawed, the consequences could be severe. The act of rechecking the situation was not merely procedural. It was an admission that established assumptions no longer applied. Churchill pressed for fresh intelligence and independent verification of frontline reports. Marshall emphasized the need to reconcile operational success with logistical reality. Both men understood that modern war punished complacency as harshly as failure. An enemy in retreat was still an enemy, capable of choosing when and where to resist. The danger lay in mistaking absence for defeat. As they questioned the briefings before them, Churchill and Marshall were not searching for reassurance, but for truth. The war in Western Europe was entering a phase where speed threatened to outrun understanding, and understanding, if lost, could turn momentum into liability. The realization was sobering. The Allies were winning, but the rules by which they had planned that victory were already being rewritten. As Churchill and Marshall pressed for clarification, the process of rechecking the situation exposed how fragile the Allied information system had become under the strain of rapid success. Intelligence summaries drawn up in the morning were often contradicted by reports arriving that same afternoon. Air reconnaissance suggested large movements of German units eastward, while ground patrols reported encountering little organized resistance at all. Signals intelligence intercepted fragmented German communications that hinted at confusion but not total collapse. For Marshall, this inconsistency was deeply troubling. The American war effort depended on the assumption that data from multiple sources could be fused into a coherent picture. What he saw instead was a mosaic of partial truths that resisted easy interpretation. Churchill shared the concern. He had long distrusted neat explanations in wartime, and the emerging pattern suggested that Allied leaders were in danger of mistaking speed for certainty. The more territory the Allies gained, the harder it became to explain what the enemy was actually doing. The problem was compounded by the human element. Commanders at the front, exhilarated by rapid progress, naturally emphasized success in their reports. Units advancing through lightly defended areas assumed the enemy was finished and adjusted their expectations accordingly. These assumptions traveled upward, shaping briefings at the highest levels. Marshall recognized the danger of this feedback loop. Optimistic reports encouraged aggressive planning, which in turn created pressure to maintain momentum, even as the underlying intelligence picture remained incomplete. Churchill worried that political leaders might be seduced by the appearance of inevitability. The liberation of France was unfolding at remarkable speed, and public expectations were rising just as uncertainty behind the scenes was deepening. Rechecking the situation was not simply a military necessity. It was a safeguard against collective overconfidence. As fresh reports were gathered, a more complex picture began to emerge. German units were indeed retreating rapidly, but not uniformly. Some formations dissolved under pressure, abandoning equipment and positions. Others withdrew in relative order, bypassing Allied advances to establish defensive lines farther east. The absence of resistance in some sectors coincided with sudden localized fighting in others. This uneven pattern suggested that German command authority was weakening, but not disappearing. Churchill noted that history was full of examples where defeated armies survived by trading space for time. Marshall agreed, warning that such withdrawals often preceded fierce resistance once natural obstacles or prepared positions were reached. The emptiness ahead, far from guaranteeing an easy victory, might simply be the calm before a more dangerous phase. Logistics offered another lens through which to interpret the situation. Allied supply lines were stretching at a pace few planners had anticipated. Fuel shortages loomed in some sectors, while others advanced so quickly that coordination with neighboring units began to fray. Marshall saw this as a critical warning sign. Even if the German army was retreating in disorder, the Allies could still lose the initiative if their advance became unsustainable. Churchill, recalling earlier campaigns where momentum had been squandered through overreach, urged caution. Speed had created opportunity, but opportunity without control could quickly turn against its owner. By the end of their review, Churchill and Marshall reached a shared understanding. The problem they faced was not a single faulty report, but a structural lag between events and comprehension. The war was moving faster than the mechanisms designed to explain it. Rechecking the situation became an ongoing process rather than a single corrective action. Assumptions would have to be constantly questioned, intelligence continually reassessed, and optimism tempered by skepticism. Both men understood that victory in Western Europe was no longer in doubt, but its shape and cost remained uncertain. The danger lay not in the enemy alone, but in acting on an incomplete understanding of him. In recognizing that something was not right, Churchill and Marshall took a crucial step toward preventing success itself from becoming a source of strategic blindness. As the re-examination continued, the consequences of flawed assumptions began to surface more clearly across the Allied command structure. Operational plans drafted only days earlier required constant revision as new information contradicted previous conclusions. Units expected to encounter resistance instead found open ground, while others suddenly ran into stiff opposition that intelligence had not predicted. For Churchill, this instability confirmed his fear that the Allied leadership was no longer steering events, but reacting to them. Marshall viewed the situation through a systemic lens. The speed of the advance had exposed a weakness not in Allied strength, but in Allied comprehension. Information moved upward more slowly than armies moved forward, and that gap threatened to undermine decision-making at every level. The German response, though uneven, reinforced this concern. Reports indicated that while some German formations were collapsing entirely, others were disengaging with discipline, abandoning territory to shorten their lines and conserve what strength remained. This selective withdrawal created an illusion of total collapse while concealing pockets of organization and intent. Churchill recognized the danger of assuming uniform enemy behavior. An army that appeared to be retreating chaotically could still choose the moment to fight. Marshall emphasized that this made reliance on outdated briefings particularly dangerous. Decisions based on yesterday's reality could lead Allied forces into tomorrow's resistance unprepared. At the same time, political pressure began to intersect with military uncertainty. The rapid liberation of France had created expectations among Allied governments and populations that the war in Europe might soon be over. Churchill was acutely aware of how optimism could harden into impatience. He cautioned against allowing public sentiment to shape military judgment. Marshall shared this concern, warning that political timelines rarely aligned with logistical reality. The faster the Allies advanced, the more difficult it became to slow expectations without appearing hesitant. Yet slowing decisions, even briefly, was sometimes necessary to regain clarity. Logistics once again emerged as a limiting factor. Supply officers warned that fuel and ammunition stocks were being consumed faster than they could be replaced. Transportation networks strained under the weight of constant movement. Marshall understood that even a disorganized enemy could exploit such strain. A single interruption in supply could stall entire formations far from their bases. Churchill recalled earlier phases of the war where advances had outrun support, leading to costly reversals. The emptiness ahead no longer looked like a gift. It looked like a test of restraint. Gradually, the act of rechecking the situation reshaped Allied behavior. Commanders were instructed to verify reports through multiple channels before acting on them. Reconnaissance efforts intensified. Advances were adjusted to account for supply realities rather than assumptions of minimal resistance. These measures did not halt progress, but they tempered it. Churchill saw this as a necessary recalibration. Marshall viewed it as a return to disciplined command after a period of dangerous momentum. Neither man believed the enemy was recovering strength, but both understood that misjudging the situation could hand the Germans opportunities they no longer deserved. By late September, a clearer picture was finally emerging. The German retreat had been driven by exhaustion and disruption, but it had also been shaped by deliberate choices to preserve what forces remained. The absence of resistance in some areas had masked the preparation of defenses elsewhere. Churchill and Marshall recognized that their insistence on rechecking assumptions had helped prevent the Allies from walking blindly into those defenses. The war in Western Europe was still being won, but it was no longer simple. Speed had created confusion, as well as opportunity. In confronting the possibility that something was not right, Churchill and Marshall had resisted one of war's most dangerous temptations, believing success explained itself. Their skepticism did not slow victory, but it sharpened it. As the campaign moved toward Germany's borders, the lessons learned during this period of uncertainty would shape every decision that followed. The enemy had not disappeared, he had merely changed his shape. The act of rechecking the situation had reshaped Allied command culture in subtle but lasting ways. Intelligence was no longer accepted at face value simply because it aligned with optimism. Reports were cross-checked, assumptions challenged, and projections treated with caution. Commanders were encouraged to question what they were being told, rather than assume the enemy was behaving predictably. Churchill saw this skepticism as essential to leadership. Confidence inspired action, but doubt preserved judgment. Marshall, whose responsibility spanned continents, understood that institutional humility was one of the few safeguards against strategic failure. The brief period when something wasn't right had forced the Allies to confront the limits of their own systems, not just the weaknesses of their enemy. As the campaign progressed into the autumn and winter of 1944, The consequences of restraint became clearer. The Allies were better prepared for the resistance they encountered, particularly as German forces fought desperately closer to their homeland. Logistics, though still strained, were managed with greater discipline. Coordination between armies improved as expectations were adjusted to reality rather than hope. Churchill accepted that the war would not end as quickly as many had begun to believe, but he also recognized that the foundation for eventual victory had been strengthened. Marshall shared this view. The German retreat through France had not been the end of the war in the West, but it had revealed how easily success could distort perception. Looking back, the moment when Churchill and Marshall questioned the briefings stood out, not because it changed the direction of the advance, but because it changed how the advance was understood. The Allies did not abandon momentum, nor did they retreat into caution. Instead, they learned to treat information itself as a battlefield, one where clarity had to be fought for just as fiercely as territory. The danger they avoided was not defeat, but misinterpretation. Acting on incomplete or misleading information could have handed the Germans opportunities they no longer earned through strength alone. In the end, the realization that something was not right became one of the quiet turning points of the Western campaign. It demonstrated that leadership at the highest level required more than decisiveness. It required the willingness to pause, reassess, and admit uncertainty even in the midst of success. Churchill's instinctive skepticism and Marshall's disciplined caution formed a counterweight to the momentum of events. Together, they ensured that victory was pursued with understanding rather than assumption. The war in Western Europe would continue for many months, marked by some of its fiercest battles still to come. Yet the habits forged during this period of doubt endured. They helped the Allied command navigate future crises, from unexpected counterattacks to logistical breakdowns. In a campaign defined by speed and surprise, the most important decision Churchill and Marshall made was to stop and ask whether the picture in front of them was true. That question, asked at the right moment, helped ensure that success did not become blindness, and that victory, when it came, rested on something firmer than optimism alone.